Great, everybody. Well, let's begin. Good morning. My name is Adam White, and on behalf of the C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today for a discussion of the Veterans Appeals Process, or as we've defined it, a case of administrative crisis and possible reforms. I'll say a little bit more about the Gray Center this afternoon at lunch, but in the meantime, let's just move on with the discussion. I have to say most of our work at the Gray Center focuses on agencies' regulatory powers, adjudication, and enforcement. But obviously, agencies do a lot more than that, or at least they do more than just make law. They also handle the very challenging and sensitive and crucial issue of benefits, especially veterans' benefits. And so, as James, Ridgeway, and I began talking about this subject, we thought it would be a perfect topic for a program today in Washington, D.C. And so again, thank you all so much for coming. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker and my friend and a co-organizer of today's event, James Ridgeway. In this room, James needs no introduction, but if I don't introduce him, then I don't have another job for the rest of the morning. So, as you all know, James is a former judge on the Board of Appeals for the Board for Veterans Appeals. He's now of counsel at the law firm of Bergman and Moore, where he's standing up a program for the American Legion, training service officers to handle veterans benefits. He's the past president of the Bar Association of the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. He's a professorial lecturer of law at George Washington University and author of the casebook Veterans Law, Cases and Theory. Now, you all know James from your professional life. I have to say I have the pleasure of knowing him as a friend. And so there's nobody I would rather organize today's event with than my friend, James Ridgeway.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much. And thank you to the C. Boyden Gray Center for putting this program together. As Adam mentioned, we do go back a ways, and I'll confess that a couple years ago when I roped you into being a panelist at a program for the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims Bar Association, my secret hope, as it always is when I try and bring generalists into the world of veterans law, is that you'd catch the bug and wonder if there was something that veterans law might teach us about administrative law generally. And so far, it seems to be working. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to partner with the center and talk about veterans law as a case study in administrative law generally. Because I firmly believe that whatever your interest is in administrative law, if you can't solve the problems of complexity and general administration in the world of veterans benefits, where basically everybody agrees on the policy and everybody's trying to make the system do the right thing, I don't know how you have any hope of solving problems where there's an underlying ideological difference and people are just trying to push the system in opposite directions. So I think that there's a lot of value for the administrative law world generally to look at situations like this and ask what we can learn and how that applies generally. And so today's program, the ultimate question, it revolves around what could the federal courts do to improve the situation with the Veterans Appeals process, which involves general questions of federal court power, and I think that have a lot of applicability. And in order to set that up, we then have to pick apart the current situation and try and understand what it is that the problem might be that ultimately, as the afternoon panel will discuss, that the federal courts might want to do something about. And so my remarks this morning are really focused before the first panel on just outlining the problem. Why would we think that there might be a crisis in the administrative or the appeal system of the veterans benefits world? And so to make that case, we have to look at the numbers. And so what I want to talk about for 25 minutes or so is the appeals numbers for the veterans benefits system. If we look at the fiscal year that just concluded at the end of September, we see that the Board of Veterans Appeals decided 85,000 cases, which seems like a large number, and it is historically. It is much more than the board has done since at least the Vietnam War era. But that doesn't necessarily tell us about the health of the system. You have to take a global view. And so if we look at the total inventory of appeals within all of VA, not just the end of the line at the board, but the field, the inventory of pending appeals was over 425,000. Of those 425,000, there are 288,000 out at the lower levels of the system in the regional offices. Now, not all of those will ultimately make it to the board, but a very large portion of them will, if history is any teacher. And there are already 137,000 that the board has jurisdiction over. They're already at the board, and they need a decision from the board. So that's more than a year and a half's worth of capacity that are just sitting there right now, regardless of everything else that could flow forward and will flow forward in the coming years. So that's a concern. Now, when we look at this in context, what we see is that the inventory of appeals at the board has really spiked in the last couple of years. The numbers of veterans waiting at the board is far higher than it has been in the past. And so how did that happen? There we go. Well, before that, this, though, is the future. So under the new Appeals Modernization Act, the board and VA have to report to Congress what their projections are for the future. And so the last report was filed in August, and you can download it from their website. So this is VA's own projections of the coming inventory of the board. So starting at the baseline that we're at now, what we see is the expectation of VA is that the number of appeals is just going to continue to grow for the foreseeable future. The inventory isn't going down, it's going up. The capacity is not there to meet the demand. And so when we put that projection against what we've seen in the past, this is what it looks like. The situation is heading to a place that is much worse than it is today. And so how do we get here? And the fundamental proposition that I want to put forward today is that the current appeals crisis in VA is a decades-long story. It looks like it might have been something that just popped up in the last few years, but if you think of it that way, you're not going to understand it properly. And if you don't understand it properly, you may not be able to understand the solutions that could or could not work. So, in order to understand the appeals situation, you have to start at the front end of the pipeline with the filing of claims by veterans. And so going back to 1997, from this chart I was able to dig up from VA, what you see is in the purple line at the bottom, in 1997, VA was getting and deciding about 700,000 claims per year. And that number was declining as the World War II generation passed away, and then September 11th happens. And we see it jump back up again, above 700,000 again, and then climb up to 1.3 million decisions by 2014, where this data ends. But when you look at the data beyond that, it crests at 1.4 million decisions per year, and we've plateaued at about 1.3 million for the last few years. So that's the front end. Now, historically, for decades, veterans appeal 11% of decisions. Maybe 10, maybe 12, but it's 11%. And so if you have a constant appeal rate of a claim process that is dealing with double the volume, you can imagine what's going to happen with appeals. But it's even worse, because when you look at the red line, what the red line tells you is that the number of individual claims, the number of individual medical conditions per application has gone up faster. And so even though the number of claims has doubled, in terms of the way VA talks about claims, the number of issues, the number of medical conditions that have to be analyzed has grown far faster. And in the 2017 report, VBA reported that the average application today has over 5 issues per claim. So we're not talking 1.3 million individual things to resolve, we're talking 7 million individual things to resolve. And in order to deal with that, this is the front end of the pipeline. This is the kind of what I think is the key part, is you see in 1997, the front end of the pipeline had 5,000 employees. And then it crests at almost 15,000 employees by 2014. So the front end of the pipeline where the claims are happening tripled over decades. as the raw number of applications doubled, but when you factor in the claims, the work tripled on the front end. And so then what happens at the board? During this same time period at the board, the number of employees is basically completely flat. And the output of the board is completely flat until just a couple of years ago. And I think the answer as to why this happened was because until just a couple of years ago, the board was part of the Secretary's office budget. In order to grow the board as an entity, those resources had to come away from some assistant secretary's office. It was a zero-sum game between staffing the board and staffing all of the other policy offices that the secretary runs. And about 2014, Congress wakes up and says, wait a second, you need more resources. Here's resources earmarked only for the board. And then by 2017, we get to a point where the board now has its own line item in the budget, so you can't take resources away from it. But that only just begins the board doubling in size. But when you compare that to the tripling of the front end of the pipeline that began decades ago, even though this looks like tremendous growth, you can appreciate just how far behind the curve the board is as an entity in developing capacity to meet the demand. And part of the reason why that took so long and why the board wasn't winning the fight was because when you look at the inventory of pending appeals, despite this huge growth in claims, the appeals weren't coming to the board. And so, how do you argue for more resources when you don't actually have more work? Well, what happened? And I think what happened is this. So when you look at the board's annual report, which Congress mandated in 1991, what it basically reports is the output of the board, what comes into the board, how many cases are waiting at the board, and then the output and input at the front end of the pipeline at the field office level. But what's not there is the inventory in the field. So there was appeals growing in the field, but there was no report that publicly reported that. And folks at the board kind of had a sense that it was out there. The folks in the regional office, the claims backlog was on fire, and that was their concern. And nobody, as an individual executive, owned appeals as an issue, so nobody was focusing on this. So there was just no visibility. And it wasn't bad people making nefarious decisions. It had to do with the way we just structured our data and the way we structured our organizations to look at different things, and in some cases not look at other things. Because the other thing that's not reported is returning remands, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But a lot of what the board does is send cases back for additional development, more than half, sometimes 2/3, and then 80% of that comes back. And so it's not just one decision that you need to resolve an appeal, it's more than two, actually. But the key thing that drove this inventory is that for years, VA had paper claims files, and there was only so much physical space at the board for those files. And so you had a pull system. When the board decided cases and it had physical space on its shelf for more appeals, it pulled them in from the field, says we can take this many more appeals, and they arrived in the mail. Then all of a sudden we went to an electronic claims file system, and the physical space didn't matter anymore. And the field could then push appeals to the board as fast as they could finish them because the electronic case files made storage a non-issue. And so you end up seeing this huge spike in inventory, which is not all of a sudden new appeals. It's this invisible ocean of appeals in the field that had been building for decades and went unreported in VA's official numbers because in 1991, nobody even thought that that was a relevant thing to have visibility on. But now all of a sudden, the invisible ocean is washing up as fast as the field can push cases forward. And so it looks like this is a sudden new problem when really it's the manifestation of decades of the claims process building while the appeals process didn't develop capacity. And so what do I mean by capacity? So if VA decides 1.3 million claims a year, which is pretty standard for the last few years, and the appeal rate is a very consistent 11%, and there's what I would say a 31% survival rate. So actually 70% of appeals never make it to the board, historically, when you look back over these decades. A lot of veterans get the benefit they want from the regional office and don't need to continue the process. There's a secondary filing step that has to happen, and a lot of veterans just don't do it. They abandon their appeals. Sometimes they withdraw their appeals. Sometimes the veteran passes away, and the appeal just goes away. But for all of these reasons, most appeals actually never make it to the board. But when you factor all that in, the demand for appeals would be about 48,000 decisions a year, including what comes back from the federal courts, if the board only had to touch them once. If the board only had to touch them once, the board would have been in generally good shape over this time period. And 85,000 would be a tremendous step towards buying down your backlog. But, as I indicated, about 2/3 of appeals historically get remanded, and about 80% of those come back, and then a good chunk get appealed to the federal courts, and then 80% of those get sent back. And when you cycle in all of these churning, and VA has said this publicly before, it takes about 2.1 decisions to resolve an appeal. And so if you need an average of 2.1 decisions per appeal, then you actually need 100,000 decisions just to tread water. Just to tread water, you need 100,000, which means this past year, VA and the board fell 85,000 more decisions behind the curve. And when you look at what's on their books today, they would need to do 287,000 opinions just to decide the things that are currently with the board. So that's what it looks like at a macroscopic level. Let's take a look at a microscopic level, because if we're going to talk about what might change, or we have to look at how this stuff works. So the essence of appeals decisions is not any different at the board than it is elsewhere. It's about finding information in the file and about writing an analysis of each claim or issue in that file. And this is where we see that the problem is actually worse, because the number of pages in the claims files keeps growing. People are seeing doctors more often, more health care is available, medicine is generating more pages per each treatment visit, and so if we go back to 2000, we can see that the number of physical pages just keeps growing and growing and growing, and then it goes haywire in the data as we transfer to electronics claims files, and then we go into documents. So the current system won't even tell us how many pages are in the file anymore. It tells us how many documents, and that's been continuing to grow. And I don't know if that leveling off is real or not, but some of these documents, and there's 200, 250 is a typical number, an individual document can be 1,000 pages. I mean, all of us who've worked in this area and have worked in VBMS know that you've opened up a 1,000-page dump of medical records from VA. So the reality is, I mean, 2,500, 3,000 pages, that's a normal size file to find information in. And then at the same time, the number of issues within those appeals keeps climbing as more and more medical conditions are claimed. And that's just a manifestation of what's happening at the front end of the pipeline. And so the work itself is getting harder, not just the raw number of decisions. And to do that work, the board has staff attorneys who have to decide 3¼ cases a week, which gives them about 10 hours per appeal when you factor in training time, administrative stuff, IT not working and whatnot. They spend 60 to 70% of their time on file review, which gives them 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds to find the relevant information on each page in the file. And then they draft decisions for the veterans law judges, who have 8 to 9 attorneys writing for them, who must sign, therefore, 25 to 30 decisions a week so that their attorneys can keep up with their quotas, which gives them 45 to 60 minutes per appeal to read the draft, make any changes. If they think they need to look at the record, look at key documents to see if the case comes out the right way, that's just the human work. And I'm not trying to place any type of value judgment on it. I'm trying to say, if we're going to make decisions about should the system operate differently, we have to acknowledge the way it currently works and have an appreciation for this is the current status quo. And then we can ask questions about, can that status quo move in any particular direction? There is an Appeals Modernization Act that has recently been passed by Congress, and I can't stress enough, as I've been saying for years, this act does not make the substantive issues any easier. It simplifies the appellate process, but you still have a World War I benefits system that it takes 2,000 pages to summarize the substantive case law that interprets that. And then there's another volume equally this thick that contains the statutes, the regulations, the manuals, the rules, and everything else that you have to apply to the 2,000 pages of the record in order to get a legally correct decision. So that's just what the world looks like. Now, maybe the Appeals Modernization Act might reduce some inefficient remands. It may eventually reduce file size by reducing procedural documents, but the medical records aren't likely to start decreasing anytime soon. And it could easily increase the percentage of veterans who make it to the board above 31% for all sorts of reasons. So that is a number that we have to keep our eye on in terms of understanding demand. So how are we dealing with this problem? Well, let's look at VA's budget request for this fiscal year. VA has requested 882 more field staff in order to deal with appeals at the field office level. And for the board itself, it's requesting 80 fewer employees. So we would expect the output to remain stable or go down with fewer people that are being requested. And so that explains why the projection is that this problem will continue to get worse indefinitely. There is this disconnect. And so what might we expect? Well, I think it is entirely reasonable when we look at these wait times for decisions to imagine, and this only goes up to today. So today, if you're waiting for a board decision, you will typically wait nearly 2,000 days, over 5 years, for your board decision from the time you initiated your appeal. And if you get remanded, like most veterans do, you can tack on that orange bar at the top, which will take you closer to 2,500 days. And if the inventory continues to build, there's no reason to think how this number might go down instead of up. And the wait time for hearings will probably continue to climb. And don't have a full analysis of the demand for hearings versus how many hearings the board is holding on an annual basis, but I think the disconnect there is even larger between the demand for decisions and the capacity to produce decisions. And then quality has got to be a concern. Historically, the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims has fully or partially vacated almost 80% of what it reviews from what the board does. And I've written articles, and there's reasons to be skeptical about these numbers and how bad this is. But I mean, those of us who've worked in the field, they know, like, the problems that the court are pointing out, they're not misunderstanding the law. It's something was overlooked. Something in those 2,000, 2,500 pages, was a key piece of evidence that the board just didn't talk about. Or a legal theory was overlooked because there's so many potential theories that might come up in a case. And so the CAVC sends the vast bulk of things back, to address something that was just overlooked initially. So there's reason to be concerned that as this problem builds, then the amount of stuff that gets overlooked, is going to continue to climb. And so quality is one of the things that we might be concerned about. But that brings us back to what we're here to talk about today, which is what is the potential role of the federal courts in all of this? If we look at these numbers, if we look at the way this system operates, if we look at where this all came from, what could the federal courts do in terms of changing this? The first question is, what should they focus on? Should the courts be focusing on inventory or wait times or quality? And I put inventory there in quotation marks, because really what we're talking about is people. We're talking about veterans. We're talking about people who have to make a decision about, can I afford to retire? Can I afford to send my kids to college? Where can I afford to live? Can I afford to go back to school? And you make life decisions that 10 years later, if you get a favorable decision, you still can't go back and undo. This stuff matters to real people. They're not just inventory. So how, from a court level, do we even define the problems and what we might want to do as solutions? Do the federal courts look for inefficiencies that might be cured? Cutting of corners in terms of not following the existing procedures as opposed to changing procedures that are inefficient? inappropriate priorities generally, whatever that means, maybe lack of transparency. I mean, part of how we got here was just not having visibility on what was going on. And maybe transparency is at least the first step in the solution of trying to figure out where we're going to go. Or maybe, the fundamental issue is lack of resources. And what if it's lack of resources? We've seen courts get involved in prison systems and schools and other administrative agencies. And what you don't generally see is courts just ordering legislatures to appropriate huge amounts of money. But resources end up being part of the conversation. And if that's key, and that may be drowning out everything else, then what do the federal courts do? And I don't think there's clear and obvious answers. I think that's why we're having discussions like this today. And so, my word of caution, though, is that the definition of complex systems, and I think this is a really complex system, is that it is very hard to predict the systemic effect of making even small changes. This is the whole chaos theory. A butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon, and 6 months later, there's tornadoes in Kansas. It's very easy to do things that seem like they'll help, but don't actually help. So there's no guarantee that any specific change to any small part of the process will have a positive effect on the whole. And so even with the best of intentions, we don't have any guarantee that the outcomes will be better when we tinker with complex systems. And I think that's what terrifies me. That's what keeps me up at night. And so that's kind of all I have to say. And I wanted to end with one final thought. And that is, there is a default solution to this problem. The veterans of the Revolutionary War were promised pensions in 1777. And when Congress finally got around to funding them in 1832, of the 250,000 Revolutionary War veterans, 850 collected. Now today, an average of 20 veterans with an appeal pending die every day without ever getting an answer. And so the problem will solve itself, one veteran, 1 hour at a time, as we continue to talk about it. But if that's not the solution that we're comfortable living with, those projections won't go north forever. As any good physicist knows, if something cannot go on indefinitely, it will not go on indefinitely. And here there's a factor that's not in those projections, and that's that this is a problem that has a known solution that we've used again and again in this country. And if it's not an acceptable solution, then we have to take ownership and do something about it. But it is a really, really hard problem. And I don't think we can kid ourselves about that either. And so with that, I think the morning panel, we're ready to get started. We can talk about this as they come up and the microphones get turned on, that we're going to have a conversation about how do we understand these problems and potentially maybe develop a better understanding of solutions. And then that'll hopefully frame the afternoon conversation as to, with all of this that we know and don't know and wish we could know, what might the role of the federal courts be? Again, because if you can't solve the problem here, where everybody wants it to work, I don't know how you solve similar problems in the general field of administrative law, where there's other things going on. So thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it, and I hope you get something out of it, that it's useful to you.